In 2021, Macron commemorated and made a first detailed symbolic acknowledgement of the Paris 1961 massacre. In 1961, during the Algerian War, a massacre occurred in the middle of Paris, which was widely considered the bloodiest act of state repression of street protest in Western Europe in modern history. On the night of the 17th of October 1961, around 30,000 Algerian protesters marched towards the center of Paris in a demonstration organized by the Front de Libération Nationale, the FLN. The Parisian police, led by Maurice Papon, had been targeting Algerians living in France, raiding Algerian workplaces and arresting innocents. The protest was a peaceful march in disobedience of a curfew targeting Algerians. In response, the police brutally suppressed the demonstrators, massacring 50 to 200 of them. Many of the victims were beaten to death or shot. Others were handcuffed and thrown into the Seine, in what scholar Leah Brosgal calls a watery tomb. The police response was brutal, unprovoked, and violent. The demonstration was peaceful. Even if it was not peaceful, resistance against the French state by Algerians was necessary. The Algerian War was an incredibly violent conflict that resulted in the deaths of 350,000 to 400,000 Algerians. However, some consider the number to be 1.5 million. French state violence against Algerian civilians was common throughout the Algerian War. And the Paris 1961 massacre is an example of this violence. This event is still a painful memory for the Algerian diaspora in France. The massacre, as with much of the information surrounding France's crimes in Algeria, was initially locked in state archives, and media coverage about it was censored. Eventually, through a scandal surrounding the Parisian police chief, the archives were gradually declassified, and the 1961 Paris massacre became widely known throughout France. While the number of dead in this massacre is a drop in the bucket compared to the widespread massacres carried out by the French army in Algeria, the fact that it was carried out in the heart of the metropole in Paris means that it has become prominent and widely known in the memory of the Algerian War in France. This video will explore the memory afterlife of this event. Instead of analyzing what actually happened, this video will explore how the event came to prominence and how it is today used and abused within modern French politics. Specifically, how the memory of the October 17th massacre in Algeria as a whole has been integrated into right-wing, Islamophobic politics. The 1961 Paris massacre occurred during the Algerian War. Historians mark the beginning of the Algerian War on November 1st, 1954, with an attack organized by the FLN. The war, which lasted 7 years until March 1962, was incredibly violent and saw massive atrocities committed by the French government. For example, French soldiers systematically tortured Algerians. Historian Raphaël Blanche considers torture to be at the center of the French military campaign in Algeria, especially as the army gained more and more direct control of the conflict. The history of the Algerian War is vast and complicated, and for this video, we only need to remember 3 fundamental aspects. Firstly, French Algeria was a settler colony administratively integrated into the French core. French Algeria has been compared to Ireland as a case study, as both Irish and Algerian revolutionaries sought independence from a metropole that was close by but separated by sea. Donald Hassett illustrates how Ireland served as a template for Algerian revolutionaries. There was a large European settler population living in Algeria. They were given full rights while the Algerian indigenous population was treated as second-class citizens under the codes of the indigènes. Furthermore, Algeria was integrated administratively into the French core. Martin Evans writes that, following the 1875 constitution, Algeria was declared to be French in the same way as Normandy, Brittany, or the Savoy. Secondly, a substantial part of the current French population was directly affected by the Algerian War. Following the end of the war in March 1962, the European settler population fled to France. By autumn 1962, 99% of the European population had fled to France, in what Evans calls one of the biggest population transfers of the 20th century. The number is estimated at 774,000 people. This large former settler population, called Pieds Noirs, saw themselves as victims and abandoned by the French state. Natalia Vince writes that Algeria is seen by some as a lost paradise, which was lost through FLN poison and Gaullist betrayal. Many in the French army had a similar perspective, some having joined the extremist pro-war Organisation Armée Secrète, OAS, which engaged in a terror campaign to prevent what they saw as a betrayal when the French state opted for independence. This feeling of betrayal amongst the Pieds Noirs and some sections of the French army will parallel how the right wing in France reacted to public acknowledgements of the French crimes against Algerians. Finally, the Algerian War was also present on metropolitan soil. Examples would be the infighting amongst Algerian resistance groups and the demonstrations organized by the FLN. Algerian immigration to France was common throughout and after France's colonization of Algeria. Alvaro Luna Dubois writes that the Algerian diaspora is said to be the longest running and largest diaspora in the country. Algerian immigration to France during the colonial period was primarily caused by labor demand and military service, with the migration greatly accelerating in the 20th century. This large Algerian diaspora meant that the fighting of the Algerian War was also present in metropolitan France. Originally, the Mouvement National Algérien, or the MNA, under Messali Hadj, was the most popular amongst the Algerian diaspora in France, and the FLN violently and ruthlessly fought the MNA. Hadj had organized and campaigned for decades with the Algerian diaspora in France, previously under the Étoile Nord Africaine, or the ENA. As the FLN became dominant in the metropole, they imposed a revolutionary tax on Algerians living in France. They also directed internal politics and organized demonstrations such as the one on the 17th of October, 1961. These protests were organized to support France's withdrawal from the Algerian War. On the 16th of September, de Gaulle, the leader of France, had promised to provide Algerians a free choice over their future, while in reality, de Gaulle still attempted to keep a limited form of authority over Algeria. The war dragged on until 1962, and the French continued to commit massive atrocities, such as the 1961 massacre, which we will analyze in this video. Overall, these three aspects, Algeria's status as a core part of France, the settler exodus and their victimhood fantasy, and the large Algerian diaspora in France are all crucial elements of context needed for the analysis of the 1961 Paris massacre. After the 17th of October, the French state and police covered up their crime. Lia Brosgal details how the government censored the press, downplayed their actions, and ordered cameras and film rolls seized and destroyed, and quickly deployed crews to whitewash accusatory graffiti spray painted along the riverbanks, claiming, "Ici on noie les Algériens," or "Here we drown Algerians." This immediate cover-up meant that the 1961 Paris massacre, much like the rest of the details surrounding French conduct throughout the Algerian War, was locked away in state archives. In the first decade following the massacre, the Algerian diaspora largely remained silent, and minimal active campaigning was done from within the community. As outlined by Jim House and Neil McMaster in Paris 1961, Algerians, State Terror and Memory, many in the Algerian diaspora of France chose to remain silent about the 17th of October. This was for several reasons. To begin with, the Algerian diaspora was not fully made up of people who experienced the massacre or even lived in the metropole during the war. Instead, many had migrated from Algeria following the end of the war. Many of these migrants had considerable disillusionment about the state of post-independence Algeria. Furthermore, of those who experienced the war within metropolitan France, the political shift in Algeria post-independence made Algerian officials look on them with suspicion, as they campaigned under a rival Algerian organization in the metropole. Vince summarizes that the 1961 Paris massacre had no place in French official history, but nor did it have a place in Algerian official history, as many senior members of the FLN had been marginalized shortly after the end of the war, hence the retreat into strategic silence by the demonstration's participants. Being rejected both in France and in Algeria, House and McMaster write that many of the Algerian diaspora were uncertain about their futures, and occupying an often precarious social, political, and cultural status, Algerian migrants had little incentive to speak about their wartime past in France. Many in the Algerian diaspora were waiting and hoping to one day return to Algeria, and considered France to be a temporary situation. Therefore, actively campaigning to promote their history to the French public was not seen as a priority. The focus of many was improving their economic situation enough to be able to return to Algeria, or waiting for the situation in Algeria to improve. This meant that the majority of early activism and engagement with the 1961 Paris Massacre came not from within the Algerian diaspora, but from the French left and anti-racist movements. Within these movements initially, another incident of police violence in 1962 overshadowed the 1961 massacre. This event occurred when French police killed 9 French left-wing activists during a protest. The activists were killed at the exit of the Charonne metro stop. The French left prioritized campaigning for Charonne over the 17th of October. House and McMaster describe how Charonne was therefore politically readable to the left since it opposed French metropolitan workers to the police, and politically safe since, unlike the 17th of October, there was no complicating factor of political identification or not with the FLN. The 17th of October was too controversial. It saw Algerian victims and not French ones, and the FLN was too controversial and hated by the general French population for the French left to consider it useful to use and promote. Basically, the French public was too racist, and Algerians were too dehumanized for the Paris 1961 massacre to be useful as a political tool. While the mainstream French left opted to ignore the 17th of October in large part, some of the most important memory carriers of the 1961 Paris massacre were former French supporters of Algerian resistance. However, very few of them made public attempts to acknowledge the massacre during the 1960s and 1970s. Only some very fringe elements of the French far left, in their attempt to mobilize and integrate marginalized elements of the working class, made public denouncements of the massacre. These groups primarily campaigned to defend immigrants' rights and campaign against racism. One example of a movement which directly invoked the massacre was the Arab workers' movement, who made various direct and symbolic displays and gestures. Groups like SOS Racisme and Sans Frontières would also incorporate the massacre as an example of a racist attack carried out by the police. However, House and McMaster write that, at this point, campaigners formulated no specific demands to government relating to the 17th of October itself. For the most part, especially in the 20 years directly following the massacre, France saw no widespread demand directed towards the state for an apology. In fact, public outrage surrounding the 1961 Paris massacre has significant intersection with the memory of the Holocaust. As outlined by Michael Rothberg in Multidirectional Memory, Remembering the Holocaust in the Age of Decolonization, the memory of the 1961 Paris massacre and the opening of the French archives relating to the Algerian War relates directly to a scandal and trial surrounding the Parisian chief of police, Maurice Papon. Rothberg demonstrates how the first signs of an official recognition of the massacre occurred with the Papon scandal. In short, it was uncovered that Papon was guilty of deporting Jews during his time serving the collaborationist Vichy regime. He was eventually brought to trial, and when a witness testified about the massacre as part of the trial, Papon sued the witness for defamation in what was called a trial within a trial. Papon lost the defamation case, and the court, as explained by Rothberg, gave for the first time official credence to the assertion that the police response to the Algerian demonstration constituted a massacre. And the case also contributed to the gradual opening of previously inaccessible governmental and police archives. Rothberg uses this as an example of the multi-directional aspect of memory politics, claiming that the public sphere, where collective memory is formed, is a malleable discursive space in which groups do not simply articulate established positions, but actually come into being through their dialogical interactions with others. The Holocaust was used by activists and in some parts of the media in these years to analogize the suffering of Algerians to a French audience. Following this trial and scandal, pressure mounted on government authorities, and the French government eased public access to archives relating to the Algerian War and the 17th of October in May 1999. The release of the archives prompted intense public debate in 2000 to 2001, and on October 2001, the 40th anniversary of the massacre, many activist organizations organized a nationwide commemoration of the event. The municipal government of Paris, after a fierce debate, made the first official government recognition of the event with a plaque near the Pont Saint-Michel. Nonetheless, there was still an absence of top-level national official recognition of the event. Even under the Jacques Chirac presidency, who made considerable diplomatic gestures towards Algeria, there would be no acknowledgement or apology from any top-level government official until the 2012 Hollande acknowledgement. In 2012, in his first year as president, François Hollande made an official statement of acknowledgement of the 1961 Paris Massacre. He was the first French president to do so. He states that on the 17th of October, Algerians demonstrating for independence were killed in a bloody crackdown, and that the French Republic recognizes these facts. He ends by claiming that he pays tribute to the victims. On the 60th anniversary of the 1961 Paris Massacre, in 2021, Macron visited the commemorative site at the Pont Saint-Michel and participated in the annual commemoration. Following this, Macron's government published a statement. Similar to Hollande, the statement claims that the repression was brutal, violent, and bloody. It also claims that several dozen were killed, their bodies thrown into the Seine. The statement also mentions that many families never reunited with their loved ones who disappeared that evening. He also recognizes that the crimes implicate the Republic as a whole, stating, "The crimes committed that night under the authority of Maurice Papon are inexcusable for the Republic," and that France owes responsibility first and foremost to itself, to all those whom the Algerian War and its trail of crimes committed on all sides have wounded in body and soul. The statement ends by stating that France owes it to its youth, so they are not trapped in memory conflicts and can build their future with respect and recognition for everyone. Overall, Macron goes much further in his apology and connects the apology to broader policy projects, specifically Macron's combat against separatism. However, we clearly see that instead of paying an honest tribute to Algerian victims, he is acknowledging the event in order to promote his vision of France, specifically a France that is held back by memory conflicts. Memory conflicts which, according to Macron, challenge the legitimacy of the French state. When Macron mentions the dangerous effect of the Algerian memory on the youth, this is not referring to youth in particular, but specifically to the Muslim youth in France. Macron's acknowledgement is related to his fight against what he considers to be Islamic separatism. To explain this perspective held by Macron, I will analyze a paper released by Paul-Max Morin on the use and misuse of the memory of Algeria in modern-day politics. Morin holds beliefs which are similarly held by Macron in his paper titled Cultural Insecurities and the Desire for Separation, Political Articulations of the Memory of the Algerian War in France, will be used to explain Macron's beliefs. Morin describes how the Algerian War increasingly became weaponized in French politics, including the 1961 Paris Massacre. He writes that the war was turned into a political issue and used both by the left and the right. After the Paris banlieue riots of 2005, a new wave of activism emerged, with the most notable organization analyzed by Morin being Les Indigènes de la République, or the Indigenous of the Republic. Some of the members being of the Algerian diaspora. Morin writes that this organization argues that France is still a colonial state in need of decolonization, and that they perceived children of immigrants and urban youth as the children of the colonized, or even as still being colonized themselves. Morin argues that this group has a separatist view on the memory of Algeria and, unlike past anti-racist movements opting for equality, they reject the republican system and its support by left-wing actors. On a side note, Morin is really poorly describing les Indigènes de la République. They have an accurate and comprehensive view on French interior and exterior politics. While Morin is totally wrong, his perspective illuminates Macron's perspective. Morin then describes how France saw a surge in Islamism starting in the 1990s. Islamist organizations used the memory of French oppression in Algeria to unify French Muslims and create a separate community, impervious to other segments of society. Essentially, Morin is arguing that the memory of the Algerian War, including the 1961 Paris Massacre, is being used to promote an ideology which rejects and wishes to separate itself from the French Republican nation. While the connection between the memory of Algeria and the perceived separatism of the poorest and most oppressed segments of the French population seems tenuous, it is clear that Macron is a follower of this belief. Morin describes many of the measures made by French governments to build a common national narrative that would allow for the coexistence of different memories, to try and mend this belief, including those by Macron, which Morin describes as using a pick and mix memory policy. Therefore, it is a prevailing belief, including for Macron, that the use of the memory of Algeria presents a danger to the unity and authority of the French Republic. This perspective on Muslim and far-left groups is Islamophobic. This is a topic for another video, but there is no evidence that Muslim groups in France want to separate and disassociate from the French state. If you have doubts on whether this opinion is Islamophobic, read Morin's section on the surge of Islamism and replace Islam with Judaism. Rereading it with Judaism instead of Islam in mind should reveal the paranoid levels of Islamophobia present in Morin's paragraph. In fact, the perspective that Muslim groups want to separate from the French state is pure projection. The French state invaded and destroyed Algeria. French soldiers destroyed Algeria. The belief that Muslim immigrants want to do the same in France is imperial projection. Furthermore, Morin's section on far-left activists is patronizingly called colonized forever ? No, they are not under some delusional fantasy. France is still an imperialist nation. Anyways, let's move on to Macron's memory policies regarding the Algerian War. Macron has sought measures to amend the so-called fractured memory of the Algerian War. In January 2021, the same year as his acknowledgement, Macron's government commissioned a report that was filed by the historian Benjamin Stora. The choice of the historian Benjamin Stora is significant. Natalia Vince writes that, quote, Benjamin Stora published his highly influential La gangrène et l'oubli, in which he argues that the unhealed wounds of the Algerian War were continuing to exert a divisive impact on French society, Algerian society, and Franco-Algerian relations, unquote. Vince also writes that the idea of bringing about greater social cohesion through confronting the multiple facets of France's past has been influential in French policymaking circles in recent years, unquote. The Stora report falls into this framing of the memory of the Algerian War. When justifying the vision and goal of the report, Stora writes that, quote, in an era of victimhood competition and the reconstruction of fantasized narratives, we will see that freedom of thought and historical work are necessary countermeasures to the fires of inflamed memories, especially among young people, unquote. We clearly see that Stora takes up the language and policy desires we see in Macron's acknowledgement. Specifically, that building a comprehensive narrative surrounding the memory of Algeria will prevent the radicalization of the youth. In fact, the report was initially envisioned to be a collaborative effort between both French and Algerian historians, which is what would be expected in an attempt to mend a fractured history. Instead, it became solely a French project. Maria Vendetti writes that, quote, whether this absence of Algerian voices is a deliberate exclusion or a failure of collaboration, Algerian novelist and journalist Kamel Daoud's comment that the report was thérapie française, that never claimed to be thérapie de couple, summarizes many of the reactions to the report, that it is an act of memory making that is for the French Republic, rather than being for the people of France, and even less for the people of Algeria, unquote. This acknowledgement and report are part of a broader policy goal of the French state, and the Macron government in particular, integrating the Algerian diaspora under the authority of the French state. In fact, the acknowledgement in 2021 came only months after the French government enacted a bill on August 24, 2021. This law is referred to as the separatism bill by many and directly seeks to combat what Macron views as a separatist movement. Summarized by Omar El Hamoud, the bill enacts many different measures such as, quote, allowing the government to exercise stricter control over associations, mosques, and Muslim charitable organizations, unquote, and, quote, requiring authorizations for homeschooling and limiting freedom of expression online, unquote. El Hamoud demonstrates that, more than being a violation of the freedom of expression and association of Muslims in France, Macron is linking the need to put limits and regulations on the practice of Islam and the preservation of the integrity of the French Republic. El Hamoud writes that, quote, although Macron addresses various issues, they all converge on one central concern. France's problem is radical Islamism. Macron, especially in 2021, framed his policy and government direction towards fighting against what he considers to be the all-encompassing threat of radical Islam. Radical Islam, to Macron, is a threat to the nation and integrity of the French Republic. His initiatives, gestures, and acknowledgements surrounding the Algerian War, such as his 2021 acknowledgement of the massacre, all fall into his wider policy of protecting and rigidifying what it means to be a member of the French nation. The French far right had a considerably negative response. In a press statement written by Rassemblement National Député of the Nord-Pas-de-Calais, Bruno Bild, he condemns Macron's 2021 acknowledgement for, quote, abusing our history, unquote, and Macron for, quote, getting down on his knees, unquote. He then asks why the Algerian state has not yet recognized the crimes committed by the FLN. He then promises that if Marine Le Pen is elected, she would write a strong report that would, quote, respect France and her interests, unquote. Marine Le Pen herself stated that, quote, Macron continues to degrade our country, and that these repeated apologies are becoming unbearable and are damaging France's image, unquote. Le Figaro, a French right-wing newspaper, also describes how many on the right decried the president for not commemorating massacres committed against European settlers in Algeria. They cite Éric Ciotti, the deputy of the Alpes-Maritimes department, who is still waiting for the commemoration by the president of the Oran massacre on July 5, 1962, when the FLN massacred hundreds of Pieds Noirs and Harkis loyal to France. The connection between the far right and the Algerian War are more than ideological. Jean-Marie Le Pen, Marie Le Pen's father and the founder of the National Front, served in the Algerian War and is accused of torture, rape, and many other crimes. With one of the major figures of the French far right having directly committed crimes in Algeria, the refusal from the French right to utter any word of apology or acknowledgement may seem ironic. However, the refusal is indicative of the reversal of perpetrator-victim when it comes to France's colonial history. For the far right, Europeans are the real victims of colonialism. In Colonial Past, Voluntary Association and Far-Right Voting in France, Jean Verreulers, Gabriel Ménard, and Pierre Permigiat explain how, during the 2002, 2007, and 2012 elections, the Pieds Noirs population were far more likely than average to vote for a French far-right candidate in the national elections, and far less likely to vote for left-wing candidates. These ex-colonials, according to the study, are grafted onto experiences of, quote, racial segregation and hierarchy, and feelings of abandonment and betrayal, unquote. They explain that some of the Pieds Noirs who support the far right have a, quote, nostalgia for empire and a desire for a strong state, an ethnic definition of nationality and citizenship, and a hierarchical separation of different racial groups, unquote. Morin also analyzed this usage of the Algerian memory amongst the far right in France, claiming that the right in France, quote, continue to block any critical reflection by refusing repentance and promoting positive views of the colonial past, unquote. Centering the Algerian betrayal within a broader narrative of a grand remplacement, or a great replacement, right-wing leaders, quote, invert the victim-perpetrator relationship. The victim is no longer the former colonized, but rather the contemporary white French worker, unquote. In The Great Replacement Conspiracy, How the Perceived Ousting of Whites Can Evoke a Violent Extremism and Islamophobia, the authors describe how the theory of the Great Replacement creates widespread and extreme levels of Islamophobia and hatred of Muslims. The Algerian War is therefore looked at through the lens of European victim and Muslim aggressor, i.e. how the far right views contemporary France. Given this pervasive Islamophobia, any apology or acknowledgement towards victims of the Algerian diaspora is seen as a threat. In conclusion, this video has explained and analyzed the history of acknowledgement by the French state of the October 17th massacre in 1961. Overall, we see that, for the French state and the right in France, the memory of Algeria has been incorporated into an Islamophobic ideology, where so-called radical Islam is a threat to France. Thanks for watching.